Hello, we're back for the last segment on the apidays interface. Again, you can still ask questions in the chat. And for now, we're really glad to have Gangadhar Chippada, Chief Technologist API Platform and Integration at Deutsche Bank, about the API ecosystem of Deutsche Bank, how it works, and how it has changed. Hello, Gangadhar. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Yes, doing well, doing well. I invite you to share your slides and start your presentation. Thank you for being there with us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to talk to you today about the API platform and ecosystem. So when you're building an API ecosystem, irrespective of how big or small of an organization, you need to make number of architectural and technological choices that you need to make and the decisions that are need to be implemented throughout your life cycle. So on today, again, I would talk you through number of choices that you have, and then whatever that fits in your bill, you can choose them. So on today's one, I would talk about some of the, on the screen, you can see some of the common pillars that make up an API ecosystem. An API gateway, which is basically, you could have an API gateway with just a reverse proxy, or an API gateway with a complex business logic that is being embedded as well. So the next one is the developer portal. A developer portal, if you think APIs as a product, and the developer portal is some sort of like a marketplace where an application or slash developers can actually browse the APIs, and in terms of choosing the right APIs for their ecosystem. And often the ignored part is the API governance part. And API governance is a very complex and important topic. So for your, if you think for UI, however, an experience is important, for an API also an experience is quite an important thing, because if if you have multiple departments in your organization, you wanted to have a consistency across the APIs basically, and also the lot of things that you need to implement right from the design all the way to the runtime, so that you have a consistency and as a good APIs. And again, some of these topics will deep dive shortly. And other topic that it gets, again, if you built a very good platform, but the platform monitoring is such an important topic as well, in terms of like an right from the peoples to investigate your issues, all the way up to make sure that you have can able to provide your 99.99 availability or 100% availability, whatever it is. And API security, this is a very, very complex topic. And again, we'll look at some of the dimensions in the next slide. API analytics, and often people don't use how much or the good things that comes out of an out of the box from an API analytics perspective. And again, we'll look at some of those API analytics that comes with the various products. API monetization, this is another important topic. Basically, in the past, people used to sell the products in the branches, but now you're actually, if you think of a case like an embedded finance, now you're actually, your API products are your monetization path. And API monetization itself is a complex topic where number of products do give you like an out of the box services. Tooling, again, the tooling can be right from the all the way from the design all the way up to like an implementation, and also from a monitoring perspective. So let's look at some of the all these pillars in a bit more detail. So from an API gateway perspective, there are a number of design choices that needs to be made. So let's talk about internal APIs and external APIs. I think just for the simplicity, today the definition I would say that, let's assume that your APIs needs to be accessed outside of your organization, then we call them as external APIs. And if your APIs are being meant to be used only restricted within the organization, then let's call them as internal APIs. So in terms of choosing an API gateway, you need to think through whether your APIs are internal, external, or sometimes you may need to actually invoke an API that is being outside of your organization, where you are not the API provider, but you're an API client. In such scenario, you need to think through what sort of API gateway that you need, even to invoke an external APIs, because there are reasons to put an API gateway for your egress traffic as well. And gateway policies, a lot of the API gateway slash products that are comes out in the industry that comes with a number of advanced gateway policies, all the way from like some of the simple ones are like checking your open API specification all the way to implementation of a business logic. And again, you choose an API gateways with the design choices in terms of where is your services are running. Nowadays, majority of the organizations have started adopting cloud. So in the past, your services used to run just on the on-prem, but nowadays APIs could be, your services could be running on-prem, could be cloud, could be a combination of them. And also in choosing an API gateway, you need to think about your latency part, which is also becomes very important. The reason for this one is based on your latency requirements. For example, let's assume that your application needs a low latency, then you need to choose an API gateway which is close to the service. Whereas if you don't need such a low latency, then you can adopt an centralized gateway approach. So next topic is the developer portal. As I said, a developer portal is where it's an experience for people to, in terms of like a browsing through your APIs from a catalog perspective. And again, if you think of an API, if you think of a developer portal, you mainly have like a two types of developers, either internal developers or external developers, which can be correlated with internal APIs versus external APIs. Internal developers are the basically your engineers within your organization who want to consume your APIs for exposing their own services. And external developers are nothing but basically outside of your organizations where you wanted to allow your APIs for integration purpose or to your partners or for your monetization of whoever it is. So when you're building a developer portals, again, you need to make a number of choices. Do I need just an internal developer portal or external developer portal? I need a combination, how the look and feel should look like. Again, developer portals were very important in terms of a good API ecosystem, because in terms of the what sort of features you want to offer them as a self-service versus some of them may need to happen through like a ticketing system. Again, API discovery is such an important topic. If you wanted a good API platform and you wanted to implement your API for strategy, API discovery is such an important topic. The reason is you could have a 10 different gateways, however the complex is your ecosystem, but you could solve the problem of a discovery with its good API developer portal, where you can able to bring all of the APIs together in one single place. And from a customer's perspective, it look and feels the same. And again, when you're building a developer portals, you need to think through what sort of provider flows that you need to offer. For example, for an API providers to publish an API in terms of promoting an API, what sort of flows that you need to provide. Again, developer portals, similarly from a provider and in similar, you also need to think about the consumer flows as well. So the next third topic I want to talk about is API security. So again, API security is a very complex topic, and to slice and dice it, we can think it from like an internal APIs versus like external APIs, because you, irrespective of how secure is your organization, still you need to have an API security. So even if your applications are accessing inside the organization, you still need to adopt an API security. So you may have a different security mechanism for your internal APIs, whereas external APIs, you may have a more complex API security. Again, from an API security perspective, not don't just think about authentication, you also think about authorization part as well, where you could integrate to some of the other open sources products in terms of implementation of your authorization part. Again, the next part in API security is the first party versus third party. Again, people who may or may not be familiar with this concept. First party is basically, let's assume that you have an organization where you're developed a mobile application, and then your users are using or accessing that mobile application over the internet. That's a first party. That means it's been developed by you, but the actual traffic is originating from over the internet. Whereas third party app is, for example, you have a partner who access your APIs from their application, then it's a third party app. And nowadays, AI and ML is a very common topic, and API security has also adopted the AI assisted and ML machine learning assisted ones, where you can have an adaptive protections. The fourth topic is API governance. So again, API governance can be sliced and diced in number of different ways. You could have a design time governance. So what that means is basically, when you're thinking to implement an API governance, think it through the whole life cycle. So that means right at the inception phase, right when you're actually thinking of an API or thinking of your product, at that phase itself, you can implement some design thinking to make sure that there is a consistency. So that, for example, you could implement some API standards right at the time of writing the specification itself. that you could able to catch and make sure that there is a consistency in your APIs. So don't wait until your APIs are being published on the gateways or they actually went to the live, and then trying to make a change is impossible thing. So that's where I think I would break this into like a design time thinking or a design time governance versus a runtime governance. You could have designed a very good API, but runtime, basically like your backends may be falling off. That's why you need to implement some sort of a API governance at a runtime as well. For example, you may have a good security mechanisms for whatever the reason you have a leakage, then you can able to catch them from a API governance that is implemented at a runtime. And also API quality. Again, API quality you could implement in a number of different ways. Some of the methods are like, and you could put some scoring for your APIs, and then the score would actually tell us how good of an API it is. And then API linting. Again, API governance, if you're trying to do it with just a manual approach or a semi-automated, is difficult thing, because then you will not be able to scale depending on how big of a landscape is yours. So think of some sort of an automation for your API linting so that you could able to catch the issues right through the design all the way to the execution. And the last thing is the standards. Again, API standards, when you're, if you haven't got an API standards, one of the things that you could do is like again, divide your API standards into could, should, must. So that means you could actually go in with like everything is more like an observations at the initial phase, then start making some of them as a mandatory things, and then start increasing it. Because all the way, if you haven't got any API standards, and right at the beginning, if you're trying to enforce all of them, you may not become very successful. So that's why you need to be flexible. Try to implement at least like a 10 governance rules at the start, or then the scale it up. So gradual scaling always works with an API governance part, because sometimes organizations goes from 0 to 100 at a single day. That generally does not go well with application teams. Again, API analytics, the fifth topic. As I mentioned, API analytics is a very powerful thing. From a API analytics, you can catch number of things. For example, latency. When you, a lot of the out of the box products that comes with API analytics, so in a various dimensions. So some of the dimensions I'm going to talk now is like a latency. A latency can be induced by a number of different things. For example, your external API might have been in front of it. You may have a load balancer, and after that you may have like a VM machine, and after that you have a gateway, and after that you have some backend bridge, and then a backend service. So you need to understand where the latency is being induced. So that's where API analytics is really important and useful thing. And also sometimes you may have a very good API platform, but your target or your backend services are the problematic ones. So monitoring your target performance is also important thing. Again, API analytics give you like a geo usage. Sometimes let's assume that you have a mobile application, but you don't know in terms of like attracting your customer base. You can look at API analytics to see that from which of the regions you're actually getting the traffic, and then you can drill down all the way up to which cities and which areas that where you're currently the customers are using your APIs. And again, API analytics start looking at your error codes. Again, you can slice and dice it in a number of different ways to look at where the errors are happening, and then based on which you can address it. Again, the developers, basically assuming that you have a good API product, and each API product has been associated with the developers, then you can again look at it, which of the developers are using your APIs mostly. And again, API analytics should not be think like and from not from just from a gateway. You can build some basic analytics even from your logs. So there is a number of ways you can build your API analytics. The sixth topic is a monitoring. Again, monitoring is such an important topic. But as I said, basically like you could have a very good API platform, but if you don't have a good monitoring systems, your adoption of the platform could become from like a 0 to none. The reasons is basically you don't know where the bottlenecks, where the issues are coming from. So that's why the monitoring is such an important topic. In such a scenarios, make sure that you have like an end-to-end tracing and uptime checks. Again, the uptime checks, again, some of the advanced topics, advanced implementation these days, you can actually do an uptime checks from across the regions, across the world, so that make sure that your APIs is up and running, not just from one region. Measure your latencies across the world as well. Again, make sure that you have a good logging, not just at the gateway level, but all the way in the flow from every single start of the right from the load balancer all the way up to the backend. So because you don't know at some point where the actual breaks are happening. So that's where end-to-end logging is very, very important. And again, monitoring, try to make sure that you can able to do a service checks. The reason for this one is basically a simple implementation is that every backend of your APIs, you can ask them to make sure that they implement a health endpoint so that you could able to centrally do this from your gateway systems. You can check whether the actual service are up and down. And this could also be tying back to your API governance. For example, let's assume that you implemented a health endpoint and you're able to do a regular ping to that health endpoint and then show that as a scoring to part of your developer portal. So all these topics comes together when you think through this topic. Again, monitoring, offer them as much as like a self-service. And the last one is then monitoring is the metrics and dashboards. So ensure that you have a different dimensions in which you're actually capturing the metrics and make them as a self-service with the dashboards. Okay, and now I'm going to talk a bit more detail into the API gateway topic. As I said, like an API gateway is a complex topic, and as an organization, you may start with like a centralized gateway. This is often the case. A number of organizations would have went with a centralized gateway. There is nothing wrong with the centralized gateway. In fact, it is one of the simplest and best if it works for your organization, because all the traffic goes through one central gateway so that your discovery and everything else is good. But what is wrong with the centralized gateway is like if your centralized gateway cannot scale, then it is a problem. So you need to think through, and also in terms of what sort of latencies that you are required, then sometimes centralized gateway is not the best approach. So what's an alternative for where you can't adopt a centralized gateway is a decentralized gateway. Nowadays, you have a lot of options from a decentralized gateway where you can actually, let's assume that you are within a mesh or within a set of services that you're running inside your container, you can actually inject a micro gateway so that you can continue to get the telemetry information, and then you can avoid the single point of failure so that you can actually keep your data plane within your micro gateway, and the control plane will continue to have all the telemetry. So that's a good thing with a decentralized, but it is a complex implementation. So this is where again you need to make it choices whether you need a centralized gateway for your use cases and reasons, or you need a decentralized. And sometimes organizations or a medium to large scale organizations will end up with a multiple gateways. The reason for multiple gateways is basically because you might have started your organization with one gateway, and over a period of time you might acquired other companies, or sometimes your other products, other divisions may have different gateway systems. So it's inevitable that you have a multiple gateways, but think it like, and how do you actually stitch these multiple gateways? Again, sometimes some organization would use an API gateway only for external APIs. If that is your need, that's fine. But again, you can think through whether you need an API gateway only for external traffic, or you wanted to adopt a full API landscape. Then in that case, you may want an API gateway for internal APIs as well. And in terms of like in the API gateways, you could develop a handcrafted one. Basically, you can write a simple reverse proxy and do it. But generally, I don't recommend, because if your organization is not willing to take a vendor product, in that case, still there are a number of open source products that are available as API gateway. And again, vendor products, basically, there are various good API platforms that exist in the world. And again, the enterprise level usage, generally, you tend to go with a good reputed vendor product. Again, traffic segregation, as I said, for example, for segregating the traffic, you may wanted to put like your external and internal APIs on two separate gateways. The reason for this one, many people do, is because your security mechanisms may be different, and you wanted to do a network segmentation to be different, and your consumers are different. And number of ways, it's sometimes good to have two separate gateways, or sometimes you may think like, no, I don't need two gateways, too complex for my organization. Nothing wrong, but you need to think what is right for you. And the other dimension to look at is previously, traditionally, the gateways used to be hosted just on-prem, where the companies are self-hosting themselves. And after that, nowadays, people are self-hosting them on cloud. And now we are already seeing a trend where there is a hybrid, for example, where the vendor is doing the control plane, you're doing the data plane. And the other extreme end is basically you may go for a fully SaaS version, which is good. That means you are actually decoupling yourself from the hosting of an API gateway, and vendor is doing that for you. And whereas you're concentrating in terms of like, and how do I mature my API landscape? So you're concentrating on the rest of the stuff. So again, there are a number of choices. Again, what I'm trying to explain today is basically what are the various dimensions you need to think through when you're actually scaling up. Again, we as in my organization, again, we have to take number of choices, a combination of what I went through today. And finally, and I'll talk about some of the common dilemmas that do come across whenever somebody talks about API platform. So these are, again, a few, but not all of them, but I just want to talk through and just give some of my opinions from my experience. So often the teams comes back and says that, do I need this? I have my service and I only have one consumer, or I may not have a consumer. Then should I need to publish on API platform, or don't I? If I put it on API platform, is it not a latency? So the simple answer of the guidelines generally I give it to the teams is that, is your API is a reusable or not? If you built the service for a reusability perspective, then put it on an API platform. Because if it is a good API platform, your latency should be in the magnitude of 1 millisecond, 2 milliseconds, less than 1 millisecond. So it's not a big deal. But what you get out of this one is that basically you're exposing an API in some of your API platform so that it is visible across your organization, be internal or external, depending on your cases, and then it gets used. Often that what happens in organizations, because lack of the API sitting on an API platform, every team end up in building more and more of the same APIs, or a deviation from the original implementation, and then everybody builds their own version of the same API. So if your intention is to avoid the duplication and you wanted to reuse, then put that API on the API platform. So second one often gets asked is like, my service is running inside the mesh. Do I need to publish on API platform? Again, it's a design choice that you need to make. Why you want to publish on API platform? For example, if it's within a mesh, and again, if your API is not meant to be used outside of the mesh, then not necessarily you need to publish on API platform. But while sitting in the mesh, I still want to get a good telemetry information. Then it's a good choice to put it on a and integrate it with like a micro gateway inside the mesh, so that you don't feel a latency, but you always get the good things that comes out of like being on the API platform. And the point is, what security mechanisms are secure? So again, this is a $1 million question. There is never a right or wrong answer in this aspect. But what I would say is that as an organization, you always need to think through, one single security mechanism is not good enough. Think it through like this: what if one of the security mechanism fails? What additional I could have? So for example, you may have something for authentication, but along with authentication, can I implement something else, a lightweight, in my API flow, so that I can still be able to do some additional checks? Again, when you're doing an additional check, make sure that you're using a two complete principles. Basically, like, if you use the same principle, and if one is compromised, in spite you have multiple security mechanisms, it won't work. To give an example, if you're doing an authentication, and you can also use an encryption of the whole payload, for example. As a result, if your one is compromised, still your second one will protect you. But again, this is up to the case of like how secure you want your APIs to be. And again, this is a choice that you need to make. Which API architecture styles should be adopted? For example, sometimes organizations do come to that. My organization is very matured. We got a lot of Rust APIs, but we haven't got any gRPC. That means we are not good enough, or we're not doing well. So my answer to that in general is basically, you don't need to have every single architectural style implementations. For example, if your organization is very matured in REST, and if it is working, and if you don't have a low latency, then you don't need to adapt gRPC. There is no reason that you need to have every single style that is coming in the market that you need to adopt. At the same time, use the right architectural API styles for your use cases. Sometimes adopting or implementing only one style may not work always. And again, people ask whether do I need a two separate API gateways, basically for internal, external consumers, and also do I need two separate developer portals? Again, the choice you have to make. And also whether do I need a two separate APIs? Some of the dimensions in which you can think through this one is, for example, if your internal APIs tend to have like a lot of your internal mnemonics, which you don't want to expose to your externals, for example, your identifiers. In such scenarios, it is better to have two separate APIs. Don't expose your complexity to the outside the world. This breaks the fundamentals of an API. You should always be think from outside in. So that means design your APIs from the what is needed from an outside perspective, not from inside. Okay. And the last and final one, what a complex landscape with multiple platforms we approach. My answer to this one in general is like if you have a multiple gateways or multiple API platforms, then how do I approach it? I would say that before you can start decommissioning or making a singular platform, try find a way to that you can able to connect all of them and give a single experience to the user. The minute you give a singular experience and a singular, so that means, for example, if I'm able to discover the APIs, let it be, you can have a multiple API platforms, but the user is able to discover across all of them, then half of your battle is over. Then over the period of time, you can able to start decommissioning your multiple API platforms. The important part is trying to give a singular experience to the user and then start taking out the runtimes. So that's how I would approach. Okay, thank you. I think I'll open up for the question and answers.
Yeah, we have 1 minute for question. Thank you very much, Gangadhar. One question is about the sponsors. Like, who has been the main sponsor of all this quite large initiative? Is it more on the IT side, the CIO, on the data side, the CDO, on the business side? Like, who has been the main sponsor?
Oh, that's a very good question. So, in terms of a sponsorship for your API journey, you need not just a one sponsor, not just IT or not just a business. It has to be both. For example, it is a journey, and in this journey, you cannot go far if you don't have a support from both the places. It is important that, for example, if you are driving this from an IT, make sure that you educate your business, and the business needs to come along, understand what the outcomes, what the good things that comes out of it. So it has to be a journey. In this journey, bring everybody together.
So last question: who has been in charge of internal API evangelism?
I think we put it as domain teams. So the application domain teams, we made it as that you. So if you wanted to build a good domain teams, and also we made some sort of a big decisions such as if your domain needs to talk to another domain, make sure that you do it through APIs, and those are on API platform. The minute you said and you made it as the mandatory, then all your traffic is going through APIs.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you very much, Gangadhar, for sharing all of this with us. Quite compelling and quite complete. We will be glad to have you in another apidays conference in person.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gangadhar. Have a good one. And so we continue for the last segment on how to release an API with developers in mind with Anna and Gaël from Amadeus. Hello, Anna and Gaël. How are you?
Hello.
Hello. All great, thanks.
Great.
Perfect. Let's. Yeah. So you have your full 25 minutes, and really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. So when I joined Amadeus a few years ago, one of my first tasks was to build a flight booking application as a demo using our APIs. And at the beginning, I thought that to ask my manager what technologies we should use for this app, and he said, use any technologies that you feel comfortable with. And I thought, okay, this is not going to be super complicated. However, my excitement didn't last for long. Even though I was able to access the OpenAPI specification and find all the documentation, the Swagger, still I wasn't sure which APIs I had to use for my use case. That's why I got in touch with Gaël, who had always been an expert in our APIs, in order to help me solve my doubts.
So at first, I was really happy to be able to share all the insight about my product with the customer team. But rapidly, I grew concerned about the experience I was delivering to my user. To give you a bit of context, we are working for Amadeus. Amadeus is the leading technology provider in the travel industry. And within Amadeus, we are working for Amadeus for developers. Our mission is to connect the innovation ecosystem to the travel industry. And basically, we're creating REST JSON API completely open and easy to use for anyone that want to contribute into creating a better travel experience. So actually, this little use cases that Anna told, this little story that Anna mentioned, was the starting point of our collaboration. Over the year, we have greatly improved the deliverable we are delivering to our user. And today, we are going to share with you some of our insights. You're going to learn what is important to pay attention during an API release, why is it important, and how you can make a difference. So my name is Gaël. I'm API product manager, and I have with me Anna Tsolakou, who is developer advocate. Without further introduction, let's move to what are the basics of an API release. And when you talk about API, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, API documentation. The documentation is the very first thing that your API will see. And as we said, first impression matter. So I have a few tips for you that will help you make a difference in that matter. And the first one is quite obvious, but as much as possible, try your documentation in the same tool as your user will do. Now, more and more, the tool that you're using to design your API is completely different than the one that you're using for your user. And that can lead to some discrepancy in the markdown or even in the declaration of some models. So it takes just 1 minute to double check. Don't forget to do that. Another tip is to use tags. Tags allow you to regroup endpoints that are working together, either on the same resource or in the same flow. You can really use them to create a unique experience for your user and to guide him through the easiest path for him to learn about your API. Another tip is to add working example. Since OpenAPI version 3, you can add several examples for all your queries and your replies. Please abuse this feature. This is really helpful to reduce the time for the first API call. Developers love to shoot the API before even reading the documentation. Plus, those examples can be used later during the application development as mockup. And finally, last tip, if you plan to release several API, as we usually do, try to be consistent. Try to be consistent in the way you're handling your error, in the way you're creating your model and your parameter. The key here is to create a familiar environment so that the time that your user is investing in learning one API is actually investing it to learn all your product. To illustrate all of that, for instance, in Amadeus, we have a global governance that is defining every resources, the model of every resources, the way we are handling error and things like that, everything commonly for the company. Then every team is free to build the APIs and their product based on these little bricks. And if you look at our open program, Amadeus for Developer, you can go to developer.amadeus.com and you will see all our documentation with working example, and you can shoot everything directly from the portal without even having one line of code. Now that we have a good documentation, usually the next step to release an API is to think about the commercials. Here, I won't talk much about private API, because in this case, you're negotiating everything with your user, with your customer. But I will talk about Open API. And for Open API, the key is to have an offer that is attractive enough to basically attract a lot of users, because what you want is people to use your API so that they can maybe use it a lot, create product, and move in your plan to become really pro, or in this case, like ultra customer, right? But the real challenge is also to have enough to attract enough people to do that, but not too much so that it is impacting your production environment, and even worse, your top customer experience. And so for that, again, I have a few tips. The first one is take time to choose your API name. Quite often, people choose a name that makes sense with what the API does. But I will recommend you to also consider what your users are looking for and how they will use the API. To give you an illustration of that, a few years ago, when COVID raised, there was plenty of COVID API. With this name, it is pretty clear that you can find some COVID updates. And as people from the travel industry, at some point, we also had to offer this kind of services to our users, travelers, and travel agencies, because they were, of course, really interested by the evolution of COVID. And so we did our API. Now, can you imagine what would have happened if we choose to name this API COVID API as the others? First, the person that would have looked at it on Google would have been flooded by all the news websites that were giving updates about COVID. Then our API would have been completely lost in the mass of other COVID API. In the end, what we should do is focus on what our customers were looking for. And at that time, they were more concerned about is it safe to travel to this place, or is there any restriction like lockdown and things like that to move and travel to these places? And we choose to name the API travel restrictions. While you will agree with me that the name is not really clear about the content, COVID information, it was answering exactly what our users were looking for. And that really helped us to drive not any traffic, not any user, but just the user that were really interested, where our products were exactly answering their need. And that was the most likely to also move along and work with our company. And then my second tip for this part is when you are in doubt, always go for the worst option for your customer. I know it sounds weird, but let me give you an example again. Let's say for your basic option, you're hesitating between two. If you take the lower price, of course, it is really interesting for your customer and they will be really happy. But a few months later, you realize that you have misevaluated your running cost and you need to increase the price. In this case, the experience is terrible. If you went for the other way around, actually, so going for the highest price and then potentially getting lower, actually going for the biggest price allow you to have some flexibility. You can adapt with the market, but you can also manage if there is anything not planned. Now that we have some prices on top of our documentation, the only thing that we miss is to really release it. And for that, I won't say much about this part because API today, there is plenty of tools that are doing API management that are really, really efficient and really good and easy to use. But again, I will give you one tip that we are using as well. Quite often when we talk about releasing an API, we think about releasing the API in production. You might also want to consider giving access to kind of a test environment, or at least a pre-production environment to your user. Let me explain. The goal here would be to have all your to create kind of a discovery offer on top of your starting offer. All your users could be connected to this pre-production environment or test environment that is much more easy to maintain and still not really plugged to the production. So not impacting your production environment, your production resources, and your production user. This is something that we are using at Amadeus for developer. When you're connecting and creating an account for the first time, we'll give you a free access in test. You can shoot everything. You will have, in this case, past data. And only if you're really happy about the way the API is working, you can even build your application directly in test. And only when you're happy about the result, then you can move in production and access the live data and the live performance of the production environment. So we went through all the basic steps of releasing an API, creating a good documentation, defining the commercials, and releasing it into the internet. Now, do you think we can do better than that? Anna, can you do better?
I think we can definitely do better. And let's see how we can do better. Now Gaël has already explained you and given you some best practices around the API release. So you have just released a new API. However, how will developers find out about the new API? And the point that I would like to talk about now is the communication. When it comes to communication, the first thing that you want to consider is where we're going to do this communication about the API release. The most straightforward one is the developer portal, I would say. You can update your change log there, you can add some banners, and also you can build some blog articles in order to announce the new API. Also, you can build some newsletters that you're going to send to your registered users. Of course, you can as well do some communication through the social media that you are using, such as LinkedIn and Twitter. And apart from that, something that we do at Amadeus for Developers is we have a developer community on Discord. So in this case, we make sure that every time we have a new API, we announce it there. And finally, if you go to an event and, for example, you have a booth, maybe you can discuss with people that you meet there about the new API and its features. Or if you organize a hackathon, maybe you can give some challenges to the attendees that would maybe have to use this specific API to come up with a solution. And here I would like to highlight that when it comes to developer communities and events, also these two are very great ways for you to get quick feedback on your API. And now let's see some best practices. The first thing that is very important is to consider your target audience. Is your target audience a developer, or maybe it's going to be a more business-oriented person that maybe later on will pass some information to the developers? So make sure that you know who is your target audience in order to make the right message. Apart from that, the time of the year as well is important. For example, maybe during Christmas, developers might not check their email. So if you send out a newsletter, maybe it won't be as read as much as other times of the year. And it's crucial to do a planning. I'm sure most of you are very busy with many things. So if you don't plan the communication beforehand, most probably you won't make time for that when the moment comes. And don't think that you are alone on that. Don't be worried about that. For example, I'm a developer. I don't know much about marketing. That's why I make sure I collaborate with the marketing team of Amadeus. And also consistency is a key. Everyone loves consistency, so your users are going to appreciate it, and also you're going to have a smooth communication with your colleagues. So now that developers have found out about the new API that you just released, how will developers know about what they can do with the API? So the next step is building some developer guides. First, I would like to highlight guides that are for technical audience and technical related, I would say. What you can do is you can build some tutorials based on use cases. Gaël earlier explained how important it is to give a good name to your API. However, you can go even further. It gives much more insights and much more information to the user when they read the tutorial that says, for example, how to build a flight booking app or how you can make a payment. And inside, within these tutorials, they will be able to discover which APIs they have to use. But it's crucial to make it as simple as possible for them. That's why we strongly believe that it's good to build tutorials based on use cases and not based on the API names. Then you have to think about the proficiency levels of developers. Some of them maybe are junior developers, some of them are more senior. So make sure that you have some content that covers all the levels. And every time you build some developer guides, don't just publish them and then forget about them. You're going to receive a lot of questions during the lifecycle of an API about your API or maybe things that are not clear enough. So you always have to go back and update it. And finally, as an advice, best practice is to make your developer guides open source. If they're open source, developers might contribute to them, and also they will create some issues and pull requests directly to them. So now that we cover the technical guides, another part of guides that you can build are industry related. And this can be very useful for new players in the industry that they don't know much about it, but they want to explore it and build some applications. If you provide them some educational content about your industry, they're going to come up with more ideas, and also definitely they're going to build better services for the users. And finally, by educating them, you will be able to have a common language with your customer. So now that we saw that developers can find out what they can do with your API, with some developer guides, how will developers be able to make their first API call in their own programming environment? So at this point, I would like to talk to you about SDKs. Thanks to the SDKs, developers will be able to access all the APIs of your catalog in an easy way and consistent as well. Another thing that you can do is with SDKs to help the authorization process. For example, at Amadeus for developers, you need to generate an access token with your API key and the API secret. To generate it is pretty easy and straightforward, but when you want to refresh the access token, which expires every 30 minutes, the developer will have to build some logic for that. So thanks to the SDKs, we make this authorization process very simple for developers, and we are the ones taking care of all the low-level details. Of course, it can be very useful for them to debug in when you give some error handling, and finally to build some code examples on top of your SDKs that developers will have to copy and paste directly in their application. Now, some best practices that I would like to share with you are the following. I would say again, make your SDKs open source. Developers love open source technologies. I also love open source, and it's a way to build trust with your community. So developers not only will like to maybe contribute to that, but also they will feel trust towards the product that they're using. Another thing to consider is the technology. Which technologies, which programming languages you want to support for your SDKs. For that, maybe you can do some analysis to see what are the top programming languages that are being used, or maybe you can do some analysis of the logs that you get in your backend to know what languages developers are using for your API. And I know most probably you will want to give as many technologies as possible for the SDKs, but from experience, I would like to say here that you need to think a lot about the knowledge that your team has and the resources, because every time you release a new API, you will have to update it. Every time there is a bug, you will have to fix it. And also, of course, your team might not know many programming languages, so you have to be very cautious about it. And finally, it's very important to have a high-quality SDK that is well documented and well tested. So at this point, we saw how you can go better, how you can do better after the API release. So we talked about communicating the API that you released, then provide some developer guides so developers will know what they can do, and also giving them some SDKs to make the first API calls. Gaël, do you think we can do more? Do you think we can do better?
Definitely, Anna. Thanks to everything we have saw until now, we have tremendously reduced the time for the first API call for our user. And we have also greatly increased his learning curve. So now, for sure, what will come is a lot more complex and advanced question from your user. And one way to go beyond is to continue making it easier for him. And you can make it easier by creating more advanced guides or even video tutorial for all the various parameters that your API is having, or how they're combining each other, how we can create something bigger. Another way to make it easier is also in helping him see how we can introduce this API inside his application. Anna, can you tell us more for that?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Something that you could do could be to build some plugins that developers will be able to integrate them in their applications, maybe without having to write any code, or some widgets that are easy to integrate and customize. And the key here is to make something easy for the developer. So if they have to update the code to customize it, make sure that it's easy to be done and that your code is clean.
Another way to go beyond is by inspiring the developer. Quite often when you release an API, you have to choose one specific use case that you're highlighting. But your resource is much more richer than what you're showing. And one way to inspire the developer is by creating visual, like there in Postman. You have in one shot everything that your resource, your API can do. This is really helpful to convince people like me, marketing, also to show the whole possibility of the API, maybe unlocking several use cases for the developer. Another way to inspire him is by showing how your API work with the rest of your ecosystem or even beyond. Anna, can you tell us?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
For that, you can build some web or mobile applications, small prototypes or demo apps that combine different APIs of your catalog, but even APIs of partners that you have or third-party APIs that you think are useful. Because if you think of a real scenario of a real company, developers not only are going to use your API, but most probably they're going to use different types of providers for their solution. That's why we think it's very important to inspire them to build this type of applications. And again, here I would suggest, it's the third time I say it, but make also these prototypes open source, so developers not only will be inspired, but also they will be able to build their own solutions on top of them without having to start from scratch.
Thank you, Anna. So to wrap it up, we give you some tips on the very basic of how to do an API release. If you can invest more time, it's really great to create some guides and tools for the developer. And finally, ultimately, something that will really make a difference is by inspiring the developer. Help him build something that is much bigger than what he came for.
And we would really like to invite you to review your API release processes in order to find areas of improvement.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really, one quick question. What's the size of Amadeus community, developer community?
Today, our developer community on Discord has a bit more than 1,000 developers.
Wow, nice. Because Amadeus is not public facing, it's an API that provides other people. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We reached the time we had for the presentation, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We've been following Amadeus over the last 4 or 5 years on their APIs, such improvements and such a leading forward. Now you are in the advanced part, so that's good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.
And we'll continue our last segment with a talk from Matt McLarty about API management in the age of AI. The first 2 segments were about LLM, AI, and APIs, but Matt will have a great wrap-up of what has been said. Hello, Matt. How are you?
Mehdi, what's going on?
Things are great, like always, and we have you, so it's double dipping on greatness.
Awesome. Okay, I pressed the right button, I think, so I'm in presentation mode. No, thanks for the opportunity. I always love API Days events. I especially love Interface being a global event, so thanks very much for having me here. So I will. I'm going to do a talk. I think it's thematic on. Hey, isn't everybody talking about AI? This is really, having been in the API management space for a long time, I wanted to sort of examine where API management is going through this lens of moving into the AI boom or whatever this new age is that we're moving into. So yeah, I'm a bit clickbaity here, but I think a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about are actually, the culmination of a lot of trends that have already been taking place in the API management space, but they definitely are a fit for, I think, where organizations are going to be going who want to take advantage of AI technologies. So I've been a long-time supporter and fan of API Days events, and I've been in the API space a long time. I am recently now just started as CTO at Boomi. Boomi's had a long history in the integration and API space as well, but certainly we're doing a lot around API management and AI as we move into a new chapter here. But this talk is not so much about, hey, let me tell you all about Boomi. This is really about my experience having been in the API economy almost from the beginning, but also before that in the early days of web services. And it's always fun. If anyone who knows my talks will know I like to start with the history lessons. But just a couple of things to highlight here. it's launching soon. Mike Amundsen and I have a new podcast that's going to be starting quite soon. We've recorded the first episode. That's the API experience that you see there. And I also wanted to highlight that Stephen Fishman and I are writing a book for IT Revolution, which is very much about APIs, called Unbundling the Enterprise. So we'll be exploring everything I'm talking about today. We'll be exploring on those channels as well. So, as promised, let's get into a brief history of API management. I think that for those of us who've been in it for a while, we may still be thinking about API management as this hip new thing, but we're talking about a 15-year legacy at this point, right? Or even before that. I think Mashery launched in 2006, but the early days of the API economy were very much about this idea of mashed up web applications. Then mobile came along, kind of exploded this whole new category that was called API management. At the time, that was kind of the heyday of service-oriented architecture, SOA. And so it was very much in contrast to that, to say, hey, if you're going to be writing these new mashups or mobile apps, you're going to need to use all these cool API technologies that are out there. So here's a new set of tools that you can use to help if you're an API provider, to help your users figure out what your API does, get the documentation, test it, use it. And included some stuff like rate limits and monetization ideas, very much focused around this sort of external API ecosystem, and the term API economy was used a lot at that time. But very quickly, and it's hard for me as a veteran of the SOA space not to see the parallels between what happened in the API economy and what happened to the early days of web services. It sort of was hijacked into this, what I will call the SOA governance 2.0 realm, where a lot of organizations were saying, actually what we want to do is we want to use APIs for internal integration, and we want to help our, integrate all the applications that we have. We're going to use APIs to do that. So we need this whole different type of API management, which is very much focused around that. That's where we got into more of this idea of layered architectures, different classifications for APIs, not only thinking about APIs as they exist and publishing those, which was the early days of the API economy, but more like, how do we create APIs out of the stuff that we have? And then getting into lifecycle, policy, definition, enforcement, all that stuff. Then the microservices boom hit around I think it was 2014 with the Fowler-Lewis post. 2016, it was absolutely screaming. And that's when API management kind of got into, okay, how can we be more aligned with DevOps and the full life cycle and automation of the SDLC? How do we get into the microservices world? Containers, service mesh was a concept that came up around then. And then there was all these new specifications and protocols that started being popularized, GraphQL, gRPC, and a lot more event-driven stuff, with being especially a resurgence of event-driven architectures around microservices. Big focus around developer experience as well, catering to developers. And the previous presentation, we were talking about a lot of those good practices. So we've gone through these three phases of API management. So what is it that comes next, right? This is what I want to explore today. I'm calling it AI native API management. It's really API management attuned for the world as it is today. And I want to explore these different categories. I'm going to go in them in more detail. But first, there was a very timely blog post that came out recently from Greylock, big VC, talking about the new moats. In fact, I think this was actually an update to a blog post that came out 6 years ago, talking about using this idea of AI as a new moat, big Silicon Valley term. How do you protect your business? How do you have a long-running sustainable business model? And how do you build a moat around your business so that you can grow without being disrupted? And in that, I thought there was, the visuals are, I think, pretty powerful for the space that we're in the world of APIs, because for a long time we've been talking about this idea of systems of engagement, customer-facing applications that have end users, and systems of record, which are the core sources of non-repudiated sources of information, back-end systems. And a lot of the work that we've done in the API world has been integrating the systems of engagement with the systems of record. So this blog post introduces this idea that, you know what, in the new world, we're going to have those systems of record, we're going to have the systems of engagement, but we're going to have this other layer of systems of intelligence, which is really what I see as something that's been happening for a while, this convergence of the world of analytics, which had been historically an offline thing, more of a function for people to crunch the numbers and then go through a long protracted SDLC to get anything into those systems of engagement and systems of record. But now with the advances in big data technology, analytics, AI, deep learning models, we're really closing the loop there so that the systems that weren't able to be real time are now real time, and that's the systems of intelligence. So they can actually plug right in real time with the systems of engagement and the systems of record. That has huge implications in terms of how systems are going to be integrated. And so, in the past, as I mentioned, we might be integrating between the systems of engagement and the systems of record. These are the classic API use cases, even whether it's external or internal. Sometimes you'd be integrating between. But now we've got this huge explosion of APIs, I think we're going to see, that are going to be required to connect all these three layers, right? It's actually, if you do the exponential math, it's going to be more than doubling the amount of interactions that are going to be happening in those environments. If you look at how AI models are typically being plugged into systems of engagement today, it is via API. So this is going to have a huge impact. We're just going to be a lot more APIs. And the dynamics of how they're going to be used, I think, will also change. I'll talk about that in more detail. So the first area, though, I just want to explore around this future of APIs is something that, as I said before, is a culmination of things that were already happening. So if you go out to a lot of big organizations today, or even, web startups, mobile startups, they have this issue where things are moving so fast in their environments. They've got legacy systems, and maybe they have on-premise legacy systems. They're in the middle of cloud migration. They're using third-party SaaS apps. They might be using third-party API-based services. There's so many APIs integrated all over the place. It's hard for them to get a grasp on how many APIs they have. So there's this problem, and you've probably heard it referred to by lots of different marketing brochures called API sprawl. Like just all the APIs. I have so many APIs that I'm using and publishing in my environment, I don't even know where they all are. And I think that we've done a good job in the API management space for a long time of giving tools that will allow organizations to add those find the APIs, add them. But just the scale of API usage, you can't do that manually anymore. And so this idea of dynamic discovery, I think, is really profoundly important. That to be to really be able to provide the full set of governance around the API assets that you have, you need to be dynamic. And by dynamic, that means that yes, you need to sort of have automated ways of discovering APIs, and we've seen some really cool technologies that do this, either by scanning code repos looking for APIs or via network sniffing to find APIs. Like there's stuff out there. So that type of capability is fundamental because it can be used in lots of different contexts. Because some of the companies, that would come to mind there, Akita around diffing and optic doing similar stuff, traceable AI doing dynamic discovery. That capability of being able to dynamically discover APIs is going to be crucial, and it has to be continuous. It can't just be a one-time thing. Being able to almost like an organic approach of plugging into the ecosystem, sensing when things change, finding new APIs, that's vital for companies that are going to be wanting to govern the full set of APIs that they have. So I think that's something, and certainly AI can play a role here, right? Because there's going to be so much to cover, so much ground to cover, so much complexity out there. Again, you need to automate the discovery, find the anomalies, be able to assimilate a lot of information in order to make sense of it. So AI is going to be vital in solving that problem in a useful way. The second one, I think, that ties into that, like if you've got all those assets and now you can find them all, is what I'm calling digital asset governance. So I think for a long time we think of API management. Let's be honest, a lot of the tooling has been very much focused on RESTful APIs, right? And that's been great because they're ubiquitous and they're used in all these different contexts. But as companies move to more maybe container native systems that are using gRPC, or they bought into the GraphQL hype and they're using GraphQL, or being more event driven, all of those interactions and even data products, like I think that data mesh is going to have a big impact here. Like we need to think about essentially, why are we managing APIs in the first place? Because the APIs are an abstraction of all the business capabilities that an organization has or uses. Well, business capabilities can be packaged via RESTful APIs or these other mechanisms, event streams, data products, and so on. So we have to be able to plug into all that, and we need governance across all of those things. And by governance, I'm not, it's not putting up a wall. Governance is really about aligning the operating environment with the organizational strategy, right? And so it's really important. I think governance embodies some of that discovery, and really being able to have a true sense of what's going on in the organization in order to make the right decisions in order to drive the business forward. So I think that this idea of abstracting this digital asset governance out of API management or extending it out of API management is going to be fundamental as well. And I think, there's some great ways when it comes to trying to divine meaning from a lot of complex metadata, machine metadata. That's another place where AI can play a role here in sifting through all of that and coming to a level of understanding. The final area to probe on is an area, again, that's been around for a while, but I think for a lot of reasons has been somewhat in the background. And that's API management from the consumer perspective, right? For a long time, I would even argue for as long as there's been an API economy, APIs, most organizations have entered the API economy, like the external APIs, as consumers first. Even though a lot of the focus around API management is on how do we give tools to organizations to turn their assets into APIs that can be launched into the economy and monetized, et cetera, et cetera. For most organizations, the first time they enter the API economy is when there's a third-party service out there that they want to consume, and they get the API key and they plug it in and away they go, right? Well, that is going to be even way more pronounced when it comes to AI, because as these foundational models come out that people are going to use, they're going to be delivered via API. And only so many companies are going to really be able to deliver foundational models. If you understand the computational power required and the data corpus and all that, right, that's a huge investment. So it's not like every company is going to be whipping up these large language models. So I think that there's going to be a massive ratio of consumers tipped in favor of consumers versus providers, and that's going to drive a lot of consumption. The other thing is that as you consume these AI models, we're already seeing a much bigger focus on ethics, data privacy, just that whole realm of fair use around AI services that we might not see in like consumer services like payments or geolocation services and so on. If you're utilizing these AI services, there's already, maybe thanks to years of science fiction that's out there, there's already a healthy risk aversion in the community around that. So the idea of, we want to safely go into this new space and consume these models, that is going to be put more of an onus on companies to think about how they manage the consumption of their APIs, right? That I think that, and there's a big opportunity here as well for AI infused capabilities to help sort those problems out. Like, for example, there's a lot of deliberate obfuscation of information in terms and conditions in API products and so on. Really being able to leverage learning models to sift out and find the important information, I think, is a good use there. But there's going to be risk management needs. There's going to be the need to control access, throttle access to third-party APIs, I think you'll see a real need around managing the consumption of APIs. So, oh, sorry, and I do have one more area here. I forgot there was a fourth. I'm so stuck on my rule of three. I think another thing that we're finding, which is related to the consumption of APIs, is that as much as there's a need to cater for developer experience, as much as we know developers are the primary users today of APIs, and if you are an API provider, you want to streamline the developer experience, give the right tools, think in that mindset. I think that historically in the API economy, too much has been put on the developers because, on one hand, we talk about APIs as products, which is a good thing, right? We need to think about APIs as products. We need to think about how we package them appropriately, how we have good business models behind them, all that. But then we turn around and assume that our only interaction in the consumer space is with developers, which is wrong. Should the developers be the ones reading the terms and conditions? Should the developers be the one really thinking through the price implications of what they're going to be signing up for? There's a whole other set of consumer personas that we need to cater for in the API space. And that goes, I think it also applies to the usage of API management. Today, I would say API management tooling is very much biased towards centralized groups, technical users, IT ownership, right? As we get more and more diverse in terms of the scope of API usage, when we're dealing with that sprawl, there's a lot more people that need to be involved. And so AI gives us the opportunity as well to really automate and streamline the user experience for all these different personas that we're going to be dealing with. So, so I've given you 4 areas where I think that the landscape of API management is going to change in this new age of APIs. Just to give a little, to wrap it all in a bow here. Imagine a bank, a fake bank. Anyone who attended any of my O'Reilly sessions, I created this fake bank called Islay Bank, which is based in Scotland. Imagine that today they've got a lot of areas where they're adjudicating products and they're doing credit checks on customers. Well, imagine that they said, you know what, we're not sure exactly all the places where we are using credit bureau services. So what if we could run dynamic discovery and go out there and find out all those places? And let's say they do that and they use dynamic discovery and they go out and they find they've got, 15 different credit bureaus being called, different plans, different IDs, and they're just spending a whole lot of money calling these third-party APIs. Well, they've already identified an opportunity through dynamic discovery to solve a problem that they didn't know that they had. But then let's say they thought, maybe there's a way we could actually solve this problem once instead of relying on third parties exclusively for doing these credit checks on customers. So they might actually either use an existing data lake on customer information, or they might want to stand up something specific to do this service, and they could create event streams, right? Which historically maybe they couldn't manage through API management, but now they've got the ability to treat event streams as first-class data assets. They create this event stream to feed a data lake and create a set of data products around credit services that they can then use to improve their credit scoring and start to throttle back their usage of the credit bureaus. They could take this a step further and become API consumers. Maybe there's a third-party, machine learning model they could use to feed some of that information, which would come back with better scoring. They could use data that they already had themselves without going out to the credit bureau to feed into that and get much more prescriptive results, much more flexible results, at the same time that they throttle back their usage of credit scoring from third parties. So they're using this consumer management. They're able to connect into a third party and do the right risk management around that, and they're able to use some consumer management rate limiting to throttle usage of the third parties. And then finally, maybe that now that they've got all that information in one place, they can start to not only bake that into their real-time systems to do better credit scoring, but using the metadata that they've got in the API management system, now they can start to aggregate that information and find some trends and scoring insights that are in use for not only their technical users, but their business community users. Maybe this is a somewhat hurried and slightly contrived scenario, but just to give you an idea of how we can go much farther than maybe the narrower scope of where API management is today, we can see how it becomes a fundamental enabler for the business in the age of AI. I mean, I sincerely believe that if you're an organization, like, yeah, go play with ChatGPT and Bard and have fun, and there's lots of exciting use cases to blow your mind on things. But if you're an organization that actually wants to get business value out of AI, you have to be an organization that's API ready. You have to be an organization that can easily consume APIs, easily provide APIs, easily integrate them into your user experiences. And I think that API management can evolve to make that a much more obvious thing for organizations. So just to summarize again, those 4 areas that I see evolving in the age of AI, I think dynamic discovery becomes more fundamentally important and can be AI enabled. Thinking broadly instead of just API management, thinking generally about digital asset management, I think is where we can extend it, because I think that as organizations become more composable, they will want to look at different packaging besides just RESTful APIs. I think that the thinking through how you manage risk and manage consumption of APIs becomes extremely important, as well as the multi user experience idea. There's going to be a lot more people, a lot more personas in the API economy that need to be catered to. Awesome. Thanks very much for the opportunity. Again, I think I left a minute or two for questions.
1 minute, but let's use it. One question. 20 years ago, if you were not indexed by Google, you were not existing because you were not in results, right? In Google search results. Do you think that with now 100 million users for ChatGPT and probably soon 1 billion users for all LLM combined, if your APIs and your data is not connected to LLMs, it may not exist in the end user interface. If you are Lufthansa or United Airlines or American Airlines, if your APIs are not connected there, when someone will ask what's the cheapest flight or to go from that place to another, you will not exist in the result. So is it a LLM or die?
I think we'll get there, right? I think that Google came out in 98. I think by 99, 2000 started to be used widely. So it was already like 10 years in when the API economy hit, mobile hit, all that. I think that the plugin framework. I think it's probably a little bit too early to tell how that whole plugin ecosystem is going to play out, right? And I think that there's going to be some power struggles there as well, because right now everyone's in the stage of let's rush in and get into the ChatGPT without maybe thinking through the business implications there. So I would just say if you're an organization saying like, should we create a plugin? I think it's going to depend on what your line of business is and what you may be giving away if you go to that model. But I do think that definitely the way the internet is accessed will evolve based on this. Like, I think it's that big. I think if the comparables to me are the dawn of the web, right, where Google maybe is the predominant player in terms of access point for search, then the dawn of social networks, because I think Facebook was the big disruptor there in terms of, if you were to look, what was the place that sort of took over from Google, at least in some respects, it would be Facebook in terms of how information was shared there. And now we have this potential next phase with ChatGPT. But it's definitely you should be looking at it and seeing it, but but make sure you're thinking about if it makes sense for your organization to do that. Because as you know, Mehdi, like I've seen you do talks on this. The way the web has evolved, a lot of times it's owning the customer interaction. If you own the customer interaction, you hold the power, right? And there's ways to try and fight against that, but you got to think through your business model.
Yeah, the last mile to the customer is where all the value is. Thank you very much, Matt, for this talk, and again for this great wrap up on AI, API management in the era of AI, and looking forward to the next conference, to see you in person.
Yes, definitely. Looking forward to it.
See you. And last but not least, we will finish this day with a talk about no more coding APIs by Prerna Sood, co-founder of Syncloop. So Prerna, we're really glad to have you. We're just like 5-6 minutes late, but you will have your full 25 minutes. Don't rush, please. Yes, and let's go for no more coding APIs.
Thanks, Mehdi. Thanks for the introduction, and I'm glad to be here. Thanks everyone for joining and participating in this session today. Today I'll be covering a very important emerging topic in the API market, which is known as no more coding APIs. So let me start with thinking about what exactly we are doing now. Do we keep doing building the APIs the same way we have been doing till now, or do we lean towards no more coding APIs? I thought it's a great idea to talk about and connect, and that's why I'm here to talk about it. My name is Prerna Sood, and I'm co-founder at Syncloop. So let me just start with giving you an overview of what has happened in the last decade or so in the API market. Let me start by telling you a little bit about the API market growth. In the last decade or so, I've seen API market growth around with a CAGR growth of 25%, almost 25%, which is an enormous growth. So how did this growth happen in the last decade or so? Let's see. Let's look at this trajectory that I'm presenting before you. So first of all, APIs started coming up with some kind of standardization or specifications in the with the coming of REST APIs, SOAP, and JSON, to name a few. Then after it matured a little, there came platforms or tools for managing these APIs. Because of such enormous growth going on with the specifications for APIs, there was a missing link of managing APIs. So a lot of API gateways and portals came into the limelight. When I talk about API management tools, some of the big names over there would be apidays, Azure, AWS, to name a few. With that said, cloud came into picture. Cloud was in full boom. There was a lot of focus on cloud during this decade, followed by integrations. We see a lot of API integration platforms that are coming in the picture these days. Some of them, to name a few, are Boomi, Web Methods, MuleSoft. So till now, in the last decade or so, we have only been focused more on creating standardization for the APIs, looking at how to manage the APIs, putting them into cloud, or integrating the APIs with the third parties. So with all this development happening, what is missing here is we are adding a lot of development complexity in the overall ecosystem. What does that mean? What does complexity mean over here? Complexity means complexity in terms of stability and resiliency. So with the cost rising and a lot of learning curve in the development space, there is a lot of friction in the developer experience, and time to market is a very important factor when it comes to achieving business objectives. Not only that, with the current growth rate, I believe in the API ecosystem, there will be a lot of LLM integrations like Bard, ChatGPT, and a lot of governance tools that will come in the coming future. So the primary focus of the API landscape from here on, after integrations, is becoming or coming up with more API first development platforms wherein you can build your own APIs and deploy them and give more power to the developer, as developers are the primary users of APIs. So let me shift my focus on how to deal with this development complexity that is coming up. So complexity, when I talk about complexity, it means complexity in terms of speed and scalability. So I'm addressing, if I think of an enterprise, what are the concerns an enterprise has in terms of um, four different pillars that I have divided them into. Businesses everywhere are trying to take their products into the market faster. They want everything to be built on API so that they have more flexibility to connect it to the other or third party integrations and make things faster. Not only that, they want something reusable components so that they can actually connect their inbuilt resources with the third party integrations. Architecture, when you talk about architecture, they're helping in reducing the developer complexity because they want to go towards maturing the API models, wherein they want more flexibility in making it cloud agnostic, creating some kind of standardizations as well. When it comes to data, the third pillar that we considered, that these are the concerns that businesses face while they are dealing with data, is they want to have more control over the data they are managing, and apart from that, they want to have a flexible way of managing data on making it more cloud agnostic. Not only that, developer experience is a very important part when it comes to reducing the development complexity. So developer needs to be given the necessary tools to make sure that they increase their productivity, reduce the number of hours they put in to build any kind of code without losing their freedom of code, and giving them more ease of use, stability, and more access to components they can plug and play. So moving on from here, I believe that the next thing that I want to explain in terms of complexity is some of the particular platforms or popular patterns that are available or emerging in the API world. Like I just mentioned in my previous slide, there are a lot of focus for businesses towards the API for creating API first enterprises. Not only that, they want more control and stability for whatever system they build, and they want to make the system robust so that they can scale it at any point without being stuck in silo development or something. So from the developer viewpoint, you have to they want to have a visual overview of what kind of APIs they are building and how they manage from there. Other pattern, there are hundreds and thousands of plugins available today in the API world, which everyone is using for integrations purpose, but I don't see a lot of uh, people actually making these plugins or developing these plugins using API tools. Moving on to the next part, so what kind of APIs we actually think will be a lot more useful for the businesses when we talk about creating API first platform or creating an API first organization. So there are when it comes to API development, there are three different type of APIs. The first one is experience APIs. Second is the business capability APIs, as you can see on my screen. The third one is the platform APIs. So let me start by explaining you what exactly the platform APIs are. Platform APIs are the APIs which help you integrate with multiple ecosystem and have access to the third party platforms. Experience APIs, when I talk about that, you must have heard about GraphQL, which is a very popular name these days. It helps you create a lean structure over the network. And with the business capability APIs, businesses are building their business logic or writing their logic just to make or automate their business workflows. So with explaining all three different types of APIs, there is a need for a next generation API development platform which actually helps in dealing with or in tackling all these three different kind of APIs, keeping in mind the standardizations as well as the security and the resiliency. So the ultimate purpose here, from after the integrations and the cloud that have happened in the last decade or so, the focus here would be to come up with a platform which can sit between the API gateway and the database. reducing the work or the effort that is being taken to build any kind of APIs, managing them, deploying them, automating the workflows as well, for not leaving the integrations from there on. Moving on, what will be the certain features that I've noticed some of the new platforms are coming up in the API field, which provide a lot of features. You might have heard about low code or no code API platforms. The problem with these low code API platforms, or low code or no code API platforms, what comes from a developer's perspective is everyone thinks that if we use the low code development platforms, it takes the freedom to code. They don't have that much freedom to play around with all the components or mix and match the components they want to use for development, which they have while using the traditional methods or the native methods of coding, such as Java, Python, to name a few. But we are looking for a next generation platform over here, which I believe is almost in the verge of coming in the next decade or so, because it will be a necessity for the developers, because coding single APIs is a very redundant task. Not only redundancy is a problem, the problem is they cannot, the debugging is another issue they have to fix. So for debugging and for speeding up the time to market, developers need to be given right tools. For the right tools, I believe that visualizing APIs, coming up with low code, no code APIs, which help them in creating custom workflows, giving them more power to code without taking away their freedom to code. Not only that, some of the platforms that are coming up in the market, in the API market, they have some of them already have these mapper features wherein they can map the input and output fields, and then write the business logic so that everything is automated from day one itself. uh, Moving on to scheduling or taking your services, what you have created, to a different level for deployment. Developers want more control over scheduling, what service they want to schedule and what part of a service they want to promote to a different environment, whether it's a production environment or any other cloud environment. So the need for any additional CI/CD model has to be reduced, because when, from a developer standpoint, if you feel that you are coding something, then you need to engage into a different CI/CD model to actually implement what you have created. It creates a lot of pressure on the developer, because he has to juggle around with different vendors or different programs to make that happen, and there is no consolidated view when they can look at the analytics or the monitoring for managing whatever APIs they have worked on, any kind of debugging they want to do, any kind of rework they have to do. So there has to be a platform which comes up. And with that said, I strongly believe that a need for API development platforms which provide a lot of visual interface, as well as more power to the developer to code and the freedom to code, with a lot of standardized models and a lot of security in place, is the future for API development from here on. So with that said, what will this API platform achieve for any developer or for any organization? I would like to point out here that with having such kind of platforms, I see a lot of upcoming platforms in this space, both in the open source as well as non-open source. I still believe that time to market for any business is going to increase by 65%, with automated standardization processes leading to less number of manual errors and giving more power to the developers. And not only that, with the built CI/CD models, 95% or 90% is going to be the saving in time as well as effort by the developer to build anything. So having a API first approach development platform is the necessity from here on. And I believe we are looking into a future wherein developers will not only be writing code using these visual interfaces and including some of the AI features as well, AI platforms as well, but also it's a revolution that is coming up, and it's for the next decade or so. And whatever developers we see, I believe that it's a chance for you to come on, hop on the revolution and move from here on. Let's join the revolution. Thank you. Any question and answers? I'm open, Mehdi.
Yeah, one quick question. We've put more and more things on the developer shoulders in the API space, DevOps, DevSecOps, and so many others. Do you see in the, let's say, API lifecycle and the API tooling, do you see also more tasks or more skills that are required by developers now?
Yeah. Skills, I think it's always better to keep updating yourself or keep upscaling yourself as a developer, because a lot of new key tools keep coming every now and then. Whenever there is a new product or new technology comes up, the developers have to upgrade themselves in terms of the skill upgradation. I feel that when you say that we need to, there is always a lot of, I'll say, friction from developer side whenever something comes. Not only from developer, it's a human nature that everyone goes against something new. It takes time for the change to settle down and for people to develop to address it or accept the change. So like you asked, the question is the same thing. If something has to change, then resilience or upskilling is definitely required from developer side. I know you said that developers have to deal with a lot of things, but what I am saying here is, with API development platforms coming off, API first focused development platforms, the work for the developers would be reduced a lot, because coding would not be some similar to what they have been doing using the native coding languages like Python or Java. They will have a visual interface and AI in place within these platforms, and they can just code using those, using simple English. And then their main focus would be on debugging, which is the more important function from a developer perspective to deliver any kind of product to the market.
So instead of copy and paste from Stack Overflow, we will ask GitHub Copilot or ChatGPT to generate some code and debug, right?
Yep. Not debugging. I'll say developers' focus would be mostly on getting the code or asking questions from ChatGPT. I've seen a lot of developers using ChatGPT and Bard, for that matter, to generate a lot of code, instead of asking from Stack Overflow and waiting for some human people to write the code and help them out. They're using AI. The developers are getting smarter day by day. They're using AI for generating the code, and when it comes to deployment or any kind of debugging, that's where their focus will move on. In testing, debugging, and deployment, these will be the three areas they will be more focused on, rather than just writing the code and rewriting it again and again. There will be a lot of reusable components within these API first development platforms that they can make once and they can reuse a number of times, reducing their effort and manual work.
But a lot of things are shifting left. There is infrastructure as code, policy as code, authentication and authorization as code with OPA, Open Policy Agent, for example. There is a API gateway as code. I've seen also like a shifting left. So really everybody tried to put everything as code. So the developers is really the center of every step of the value chain of the, let's say, the API deployment.
Yeah. So
yeah, thank you, Prerna. Thank you very much for being there and sharing that with us. Again, we can follow you on Twitter, LinkedIn, or go or see what you do with Syncloop. Yeah, we're really glad to have you, and yeah, we'll wrap up the conference. See you at next API Days conference, Prerna.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak at the conference, and looking forward to many more in person. Thank you.
Yeah. See you. So that was for day one of API Days interface, depending on the time zone you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We'll be back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern, where we will talk about API lifecycle management and API as a product and business models. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and see you tomorrow morning Eastern Time. Bye.